Well, hey everybody, it's Jeff Adler, continuing the video series here that follows up my book, Why I'm Right, and uh, trying to expand on the ideas that we've discussed so far about the differences between liberalism and conservatism. And we've discussed a lot of things, but I wanted to get into the history of both of the parties, Democrat and Republican parties, and what makes them tick, what continues to make them tick, despite the big lie that Democrats try to perpetrate on people today about how they uh, changed everything about 50 or so years ago, and they are no longer that party of the past. Those that will actually acknowledge the fact that their history is dark and evil. I contend that nothing's changed; that they just changed their tactics, not their desires. That they are still evil and they are still dark. But we'll get into that in the last segment. This may take a while. We're going to deep dive into the history of the parties and explain why things are the way they are a little bit. But before we go any further, I'm going to pull out the old whiteboard here and show you some numbers. I'm not going to explain them, I'm just going to show them to you. For those of you who are politically astute, you may understand what these numbers mean. For those who are not, wait for it. So, these numbers happen to be historically important and hugely telling, and a nice window into what makes the parties tick and what they're all about. But let's go back into history. 1792, that's going back into history. The first party that was an opposition party to the Federalists was the Republican Party, which was originally named that way because Madison and Jefferson and Monroe, who belonged to this party, saw fit that they needed to oppose the Federalists, who were made up of Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, because they were looking like folks that wanted to expand government. And while they held sway as the first two presidents of the United States, it looked like they were going to have to do something about it. Madison didn't want two parties, but he saw the need of an opposition party as colleagues convinced him to change his mind, and he did. And thus the opposition party, called the Republican Party, was born. It was based on small government, a government by the people, which is what republic means in the first place. And it was meant to cancel out or control the ways that the Federalists wanted to run the government. They were somewhat successful, and then, of course, once Thomas Jefferson became president as the first non-Federalist, they held sway for the next three or so presidents, and their more conservative way of running government became the way it was run. It was pretty successful despite another war with England and having to build the White House and rebuild the Capitol and some other things. They were fairly successful. The country was being run, finally, in Madison's eyes, the way that it had been intended by the framers and the founders of the government, the way the philosophies of their favorite philosophers had, how they had used that philosophy to create the government in the first place, and all the rest. But after that, and during that time also, by the way, as a means of derision, the Federalists had added the word Democrat to their party name, Democrat Republican, and rather than counteracting against that, they just basically took that name and said, okay, we're the Democrat Republican Party. But after Monroe, there was a sea change that occurred in politics in the United States. The conservative Republican ways of the Democrat-Republican Party had ceased to exist, and in fact were instead being overrun by more federalist type people, more larger government, uh, does more things kind of folks. And the Republican Party eventually started to just drop the Republican part and just be known as the Democrat Party. And that is the Democrat Party as we know today. They were nothing like the Republicans they had started out to be, and were becoming less and less like them. The Federalists by the 1820s were gone, and opposition parties didn't really exist for a while. So they had full sway on how the government was run, and they were getting more and more liberal as the time was passing. During this time also, another major change had occurred, and that is with the change of the Democrat-Republican Party into the Democrat Party, which was officially named as such in 1844, the ways in which the government treated people of color was starting to change. Now, they already had slaves, we already know this, but they're also starting to treat Native Americans differently. Now, there had been treaties, some of them broken. There had been relocations for the expanse of white men up until that time. But it didn't hold a candle to what was happening after 1820, well into the 1850s. In that period of time, it was anti-Native American on steroids. The numbers of treaties made and broken, the relocations of thousands and thousands, entire tribes in some cases of Indians, much to their detriment, went way up under Democrat presidential and administrative rule. They were the first real party to break major treaties and to basically treat the Native Americans, or American Indians, if you will. I think anyone born here is a Native American, but you know who I'm talking about, in a really negative way. Another thing that was, of course, starting to come to a head more and more on a regular basis, on a daily basis, was the issue of slavery. Now, everyone had slaves in the South. Almost everyone, not everyone, but I mean, a lot of people had slaves in the South, some in the North. Jefferson and Madison themselves had slaves. For financial reasons, they wanted to end slavery and Thomas Jefferson put a denigrating clause in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, but the southern states would not sign it if that was still in there, so he had to take it out. And when he took it out, the southern states signed the Declaration of Independence. There wouldn't have even been a nation, let alone an argument about slavery later, if he hadn't done that. No choice. Later on, Madison, the father of the Constitution, also wanted to put in clauses, anti-slavery clauses or restrictions or what have you, in the Constitution. The southern states balked at that. They would not have ratified the Constitution. So again, they had to walk away from it. Now, they would have gladly, well, not gladly, but they would have had to basically give up their slaves if either of those things had come to pass and just made do somehow. Maybe they would have just been destitute, but they would have had to make do. As it were, they both gave up their slaves in their wills upon their deaths, and they all became free people. So they put their money where their mouth was, they just couldn't do it financially. Now, that may not be something you'd want to write on your gravestone. I gave up my slaves, but not until I was dead. But it was more than a lot of people were doing, and it was a lot better than the way slaves were thought of and treated by Democrats later on. Another thing that people like to harp on, of course, is the two-thirds rule. For those of you not familiar, Thomas Jefferson as president, when he finally became president, the first non-federalist to become president, he said, by this time they were still calling themselves Democrat Republicans, he said that in order to, basically he wanted to punish the South for not getting on board with the beginnings of pulling back on slavery. And so he basically said that the political value of all slaves in the South was 2/3 of a white person. Now, the clever libs like to say that Jefferson and his ilk wanted to say that they believed that blacks were only worth as human beings 2/3 of a white person. This couldn't be further from the truth. It had nothing to do with their value as human beings. It had to do with their value politically. He wanted to punish the South. So to do that, he understood that the blacks made up a huge, huge percentage of population in the South. And since Congress was in the House of Representatives, was represented based on population, he figured if the blacks who were slaves were only counted as 2/3 of a person, then a full 1/3 of all the slaves would become persona non grata, politically speaking. That means less representation to Congress, and by having less representation, the South had less sway in the events of the day, in the laws that were passed, and were hindered in expanding slavery the way they wanted. The Democrats in the South were fuming that they had no choice in the matter, and so for a while there they were kept at bay. But then things changed. The Republican-Democrat Party, as I might have said, has completely switched. They had lost the original beliefs of classical liberalism. They had completely, after Monroe, given up on the conservative republicanism that they were espousing, and instead started to adapt and adopt the more left-wing, larger government, federalist type of way of doing things. They had become officially the Democrat Party in the 1830s, and or they called themselves the Democrat Party, and by 1844 they were officially that. But in England they were already working on anti-slavery. William Wilberforce, over many decades, fought against slavery in England, and he finally got his way after many years fighting uphill. And in this country, we were lagging behind, and it was becoming an issue. In 1820, the forces that be decided that they were going to try to control Congress, or try to control slavery a different way. The Democrats wanted to expand slavery, and the other parties, of which they came and went, year after election, with not really being able to put a president up that was elected, but nonetheless had some sway in Congress, wanted to restrict the expansion of slavery. Abolition was born in these times, and the idea to abolish slavery was variations of that, but one variation became what was known in 1820 as the Missouri Compromise, and that was basically a way where the compromise was that the southern states or the Democrats anyway, got to expand slavery by adding slave states to the overall number of states. But all the states that were not slave states were and were to remain free states. And any new states that were added to the Union in the future, that had to be decided at the state level, not the federal level. Now, this was a very tenuous agreement. This was really argued back and forth. The right side of the aisle, if you will, was not happy with the fact that the slave states were being added to. And the left side of the aisle, if you will, the Democrats, were not happy that the new states and these other states couldn't be expanded and made into slave states. But nonetheless, the compromise was made, and it lasted, believe it or not, for 30 years. 30 years. So, it was, for all intents and purposes, successful. Now, in 1832, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, started the National Republican, was a member of the National Republican Party, one of these parties that came and went. They took on the word Republican since the Democrats had abandoned it. And for good reason. They were becoming like Democrats. And he became a member of the Whig Party. Now, the Whig Party was a party that took its name from the English by two-party system, Whigs and Tories, the Whigs being more conservative, the Tories being more liberal in England. And that came about from a split in the Democrat Party, where the Northern Democrats were a little less willing to expand slavery, weren't necessarily against slavery, but per se, but were not wanting to expand it, arguing with those in the South who wanted to expand it. And the Whigs were a result of that split. If anyone's seen the movie Amistad, with Anthony Hopkins playing John Quincy Adams after he was president and back into the Senate, portrayed him as somewhat of a doddering old fool who slept during Senate hearings or meetings, what have you. The story crosses him with a slave ship who should not have been should not have been slaves, and he went all the way to the Supreme Court to fight it, showing that he as a Whig was anti-slavery, at least to the point of when it was right to be anti-slavery. Now, he didn't fight that existing slaves should not be slaves. He didn't necessarily fight to end slavery per se right there on the button, but you could see that in the 1830s there was a hot topic, and it was ripe for discussion, and trying to end slavery even at that time was a big deal. But that right there was the seeds, the foundation of a future party and its platform. Unbeknownst to anybody, John Quincy Adams, in some unknown way to him, he actually laid the foundation of a future party that would go on to become the forever opposition party to the more liberal Democrat Party. And it all began with the idea of humanitarian principles and a somewhat prototype of an anti-slavery movement. Abolition became something a little bit more important when John Quincy Adams fought on the behalf of Africans to keep them from becoming slaves. So then came some major events in 1850s. By this time, understand that Democrats have held sway in Congress for 20 years, 30 years. There was very little opposition party that could do anything. None of them won a damn thing. The Democrats were in control the whole time. From the throughout the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, for the most part. John Quincy, I think, was a president in the 1820s, but it wasn't much. They didn't hold a lot of power. Now, what happened in the 1850s is huge, and we'll get into that in our next segment on part 2. All right? We'll see you on that one. Bye for now.